Hi, thanks for taking some time to spend with me. My name is Mark Galpin. I am the Solutions Architecture Lead at Tidelift, and I'm here today to talk about the Log4Shell security vulnerability that you've probably been hearing about everywhere you go on the internet. Now, despite the fact that you've been hearing about this everywhere you go, I'd like to just kind of start from the beginning, talk to you a little bit about this vulnerability, where it comes from, how bad it is, and then tell you a little bit about how Tidelift customers have experienced it and what you can do. So first of all, to start, let's talk about what is Log4j. The name Log4Shell comes from the name of the library that it is impacting, which is called Log4j. And Log4j is the most popular library for logging application information in Java. And I think it's pretty much fair to say that basically every enterprise organization who uses Java in any way is probably been impacted by this, just in terms of sort of our data on the libraries themselves. We record that Log4j core has 3,600 packages that depend on it directly. And we think that there's over 20,000 packages and repositories and code collaboration platforms that rely on Log4j, and that's just the public code available. And as a data point, all of Tidelift's customers that use Java were using Log4j core on one or more projects. Now, just as a side note, not everybody who uses Log4j is using Log4j core. If you are using a very old version of Log4j, 1.x, then you're not impacted by this vulnerability. And some people are using Log4j strictly through the Log4j API library, not the Log4j core library. And in that case, you are also not impacted. But the vast majority of people have exposure to Log4j core, at least somewhere in their stack. So what is this vulnerability and why is it a problem? And the first thing to highlight is that it's this 10.0 CVE severity issue. So obviously it's a serious problem here. So what is it? Well, basically what's happening here is that you get a log message into your logs, and Log4j interprets that as a URL that it goes out and fetches, and then executes executable payload it finds at that URL with the full privileges of the main program. This is a remote code execution vulnerability, and in fact, a very flexible and exploitable one. And so Microsoft says that they had observed in their own security research on this, that this vulnerability has already covered the range of people installing coin miners, people stealing credentials, people moving laterally within systems, and exfiltrating data from confidential systems. This is about as bad as it gets. I really can't think of an easy way to make it much worse. And why is this so bad? And why is it so comprehensive? Why is the entire internet talking about this right now? And the real answer here is that pretty much everything logs stuff, and many systems take input from users or APIs and put it straight into a log message. And in fact, I know I personally have written code that goes and validates an input, and when it fails that validation, writes it to the log for later analysis or to determine if it was an attempt at an attack. And if you have code that's doing that, then you're just basically setting yourself up for trouble in this case. And logging services are everywhere. They are part of sensitive systems. And in fact, they're more common and more frequent in some ways, the more sensitive the system is, because the more then you care about auditing it and the more you care about uptime and debugging. And this is, this is the nightmare of zero-day vulnerabilities. As soon as it came out, people started exploiting it. In fact, before it was announced, people started exploiting it. The CVE was filed on the 10th of December. I have a screenshot from an instance, and you see here that we recorded this vulnerability first on the 9th of December. And so we got in a little bit ahead of the CVE publication when we first became aware of this. But if you talk to security researchers and you go online and research how long has this been out there in the wild being exploited, most people are coming up with numbers around December 1st. So it is currently December 14th. And if you haven't patched this, this has been out there in the wild being exploited for 2 weeks now. And just to make life worse, as soon as this was announced over the weekend, security researchers say that the incident of people probing IP addresses, apparently looking for this attack vector, went up by at least a factor of 100. So hackers are out there right now trying to crack your systems and exploit this vulnerability. But it can be fixed. Tidelift's recommendation on how to fix this is very simple: upgrade to version 2.16.0. Just as a side note, this will only work for users of Java 8 and above. Or alternatively, there are instructions on the Log4J site on how to remove JNDI, which is the actual attack vector, from the class path. And at the moment, as I'm currently speaking, these are the only 2 ways known to fully mitigate this issue. So what is the issue? How does this attack work? So basically, this is using JNDI, which is a way to look up information, usually about users or services. And what happens is an attacker makes a request either through some sort of user interface, or much more likely through the headers of an API request to an application. The application logs that request in full. And if that contains a certain string that indicates that it should go out and do a JNDI query, that string can specify what server it goes out to query. And the JNDI process then receives a payload and launches the payload. And the idea here is this is supposed to improve the data quality of the log by giving you, some more in-depth information about an object. But it can execute anything you want. And I want to call out Security Boulevard. I am using their awesome graphic for this. I looked at a whole bunch of blogs over the weekend, and they had the best graphic. So I definitely want to credit them for this really clear explanation of the vulnerability. So how does Tidelift help? And I want to say, before I get into how Tidelift helps, that I feel a bit of deja vu. Back in 2014, I was working for a large software organization and had the security lead walk into the lab and say, "What are you doing today?" And we all said what we're doing. He says, "No, you're not. We've just discovered this great new vulnerability in SSL, and you are spending the rest of your time figuring out how severely impacted we are." This, of course, for those of you who can remember it, is Heartbleed. And so much of the Heartbleed story and this one have similarities. It was an attack. It had probably been available in the libraries for a while by the time it was discovered. The library itself is, maintained by people that not everybody is kind of aware of where it is. It's kind of one of those deep infrastructure type libraries that people don't tend to think a lot about. And so one of the questions I ask myself is, how is that improved? And Tidelift plans to do a broader webinar on that topic where I dive deeper into that question in January, and I encourage you to join us then. But I definitely want to say that one of the things that has improved is that we have tools now. And I believe that Tidelift is one of the best of those tools. And an actual customer, when we've been discussing this issue with our customers this week, commented that their security team was currently assessing the scope of the Log4j usage. And the fact that Tidelift generates an OSS usage inventory report was a great starting point for them, and let them get an insight into the usage of Log4j core across their organization and what projects they had that needed attention? Because that's really the question, isn't it? I mean, yeah, it's easy to say everybody with Java is impacted and needs to check what's going on. And that is a true statement. But how do you go about doing that? When my team was trying to determine who was impacted by Heartbleed, this involved a lot of very careful, hand checking files to try to find what libraries we were actually depending on and how those things brought in. With a tool like Tidelift, you can get a software bill of materials for your project, and we collect a software bill of materials with customers who are following best practices every time they do a build or a pull request. And you get a very clear sense of all of the places where it's hiding, not just as a direct declaration, but as transitive dependencies. One of the things about logging libraries is that very often the logging library will be a transitive dependency and still have data passed to it, and the log actually be, this logging library actually be processing it. And along the way, because we're collecting those bill of materials all the time, we also allow you to track things as they're being fixed. Because it's one thing to start at the start of this and come up with, here's the list of all the projects that need to do work, but how do you track that in real time as time goes on to know what is being affected? And it's not just now, it's easy to say, oh, we've got this list of 100 projects, we'll fix it in all 100 projects and then we're done. No, it's not that easy. You might bring in something else, you might acquire another company, somebody might typo and go to an old version. This is going to be with us for a very long time, and it could potentially creep back in even after you've eliminated it the first time if you're not watching carefully. And one of the really great things about Tidelift's approach to managing open source is the fact that we allow a centralized team to provide recommendations and timelines through the application straight into the build and inject that in there without interfering so much that the development teams are completely broken and can't move forward and can't do their jobs, but make sure that they're aware of issues like this and what the central team thinks they should be doing and how much time they have to resolve it. And that's really what we do for our subscribers. But I want to talk about another key part of Tidelift's vision here, because it's really relevant to what happened, or to what's happening right now, I think I should really say. And I want to take a moment to call out and applaud the maintainers of Log4J. As is the case for many critical libraries on the internet, the maintainers for Log4j are not being paid. And this is a really, really shitty week they're having. Everybody makes mistakes when they're writing code. I've been writing code for 20 years now, and I have never yet written a perfect piece of code. I have never met anybody who has written a perfect piece of code at any particular scale. I can't speak for you. Maybe you write perfect code, but most people do not. And you really have to appreciate people that there is probably no worse way I can think of to find out about something like this. Something that in some ways, if you look at it in retrospect, it's like, oh, maybe that should have been obvious. But no, like everybody misses things like this. The fact that it's been in there for as long as it has is a clear indication of the fact that this isn't, actually obvious to find, despite what somebody might think in hindsight. And they've been out there going out and working really hard over the weekend and putting out new versions, updating the community, being very, very transparent. And they didn't have to do this. This is an open source project. They could have just walked away, said, I'm busy this weekend. I don't want to deal with it. And they're not getting paid. I would love to say that Tidelift was actually paying the Log4j maintainers for their work this weekend, but certainly at the start of this, we were not. But if you're a maintainer of an open source library like Log4j, please give us a call if you'd like to be paid. That is what we do. This is Tidelift's mission, is to do it. And if you're a company that thinks that me describing that a critical library that you depend on has unpaid developers that are fixing security issues of CVSS score 10 out of the goodness of their hearts, and you find that vaguely disturbing, and you would like to help fix that, also please give us a call. Tidelift subscribers get all these benefits I described earlier, and we take the vast majority of the revenue we receive from our subscribers and pay it to maintainers of libraries like Log4j to ensure that they get well maintained and to give them some compensation for shitty weeks like this one when they arise, as well as giving them help along the way to help them with disclosure processes and other security processes along the way. Not that it would have prevented this particular thing, but it will help them be in a good place when they have to get to a point where they have to issue a fix really quickly. And so thank you again to the Log4j maintainers. Now let's talk about some specific features that Tidelift brings to do the things I just talked about. And then we'll get into a product demo. So first of all, we have a reverse component lookup. I mentioned from a customer talking about our OSS usage report. You can also go straight into a package and see its security vulnerabilities and all of the projects that are impacted by that security vulnerability. You can see an actual screenshot from a customer instance on your right there. It is completely blurred out so that you can't figure out what customer it is or what their libraries are. You also have proactive communication. So at Tidelift, we want to partner with you. And I'm not saying every single time a security vulnerability drops, we're going to notify you. But in this case, we reached out directly to our customers and talked to them about the severity of this issue as soon as we became aware of it. And that was just like on a personal note to our larger subscribers. We have project health, where we start tracking the score so you can see as projects start remediating issues. We show you the dependency chain so you know, how did this library get into your project and where do you need to go to fix it? And we issue a task report. So I talked about, we send a personal email to our customers, but also customers get a task alert. When a new security vulnerability comes in, they get alerted and say, here's the projects that are impacted. And again, in this particular case, we managed to get that out before the NVD vulnerability had been reported. So what does that actually look like in the product? So here's that task I mentioned. And if we see that it impacts my Maven example project, and if we go to review it, we actually see that there are now 2 security vulnerabilities. One is the CVE that we're all talking about, the Log4Shell CVE. And then additionally, it had been thought that that was fixed in 2.15.0. And just today, on the 14th of December, they announced that the original fix was not complete and reported another security vulnerability. So we now have these 2 security vulnerabilities that are at issue. And so this is one way you could have come and found out about it. But you also could have gone in straight, if you're, say, the security team trying to do a risk assessment, and gone for Log4j and seen, okay, here's Log4j core. And here's the requested versions. We have a 2.14.0 out there that people are trying to use. What are the vulnerabilities in that? Here's these 2 2021 vulnerabilities. Here's your 10.0 CVE. Here's the projects using them, this Maven example project. We can look at the general package info on this. It's Apache 2, that 2.16.0 was released on the 12th of December. And if we see the full version guidance, we see that at the moment, 2.16.0 is the only release. And just a note for people upgrading to 2.16.0, there are some behavior changes. You may notice those behavior changes when you upgrade to 2.16.0, but it's still the only safe thing to do. And if you do see behavior changes that impact you, then that's probably just a sign that you had a problem before, and it's still worth the effort of going through it. Or we could look at this the other way. Maybe I'm a developer and I want to know if my project has been impacted. And here I can see, ran a run, and I can see, there's a problem. Here's my Log4j core in the dependency chain. And this has an unresolved task, which is why it's listed as requested, as opposed to these ones up here, which have specific comments to the developers about not using them for various different reasons. Or I can go into the bill of materials and say Log4j and look straight in here, and I see 2.14 is the version. The current release is 2.16. Let's see our dependency chain, 2.14.0. So with a tool like Tidelift, getting started on fixing this should be fairly easy. And if you don't have Tidelift today, I think it's a really great idea that you consider it. If you'd like to talk more about sort of security vulnerabilities like this and remediation processes and how that's changed over the last decade, again, we'll be having another webinar in January when we get back from the holidays. And good luck working on the security vulnerability. Keep your eyes peeled. Probably Log4j is going to be getting a lot of scrutiny in the next several weeks. And so keep an eye on it, and otherwise have a great holiday.